Good evening, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us tonight. This is the third in our series of panels on fashion and degrowth, and this one's titled Explaining the Link Between Decolonisation and Sustainability. And the reason we wanted to look at this is very much that in any process of degrowth, we have to centre the most vulnerable peoples, particularly those directly experiencing the effects of the climate emergency created by consumption levels in the global north. So it really is looking at how to prioritise those who currently make our clothing, but also beyond to all the cultures that have been sidelined by the dominant fashion system. And for this, really, we couldn't think of anyone better than the cultural anthropologist Sandra Niessen, who wrote an article called Fashion, Its Sacrifice Zone and Sustainability. It's one of those articles which I think once you read it, sets off, as I told Sandra just before this talk, so many light bulbs in your head about unspoken assumptions of what we expect the global south to deliver to the global north, and exactly how high the costs are to those people to make our clothing. And that it's not just in terms of labor that perhaps that they could use elsewhere, but also in terms of lost cultures and lost traditions, lost heritages. One of Sandra's key phrases, for example, is racism is built into the definition of fashion. This amounts to an erasure of the systems of dress belonging to all other peoples on the globe, while highlighting the Western and now globalized fashion system. Just so that you know exactly who Sandra is, Sandra has researched batik weaving in North Sumatra, Indonesia since 1978, resulting in 4 books, a film, numerous articles, as well as activism to encourage the tradition. She was assistant professor in the Department of Human Ecology, University of Alberta, Canada, and is a member of the research collective for decolonising fashion. Tonight, she's in conversation with Extinction Rebellion co-founder Clare Farrell. Thanks both.
Thank you so much, Belle. And hi, everybody. It's a real privilege to see you again, Sandra. We met through doing a panel a little while ago talking about fashion, and I was really, really glad to be introduced to your work. So let's just start. We've got a list of questions to run through, and then a little space at the end to ask a few questions that come in from the audience. So first of all, do you want to just explain what inspired you to write this piece, Fashion, Its Sacrifice Zones and Sustainability? I know that when we spoke before, you said that there were quite a few parts that had been in your mind and your heart maybe for some time before you wrote this piece.
Okay, Claire, I'd love to. And I want to say, first of all, thank you so much for having me. Thank you, Belle, for that amazing introduction. I'll try my best to fill the shoes that you've shown that are supposed to be on my feet. And I also want to say what an honor it is to be with Fashion Act now. I'm an academic, as you've pointed out. I have certainly half of my heart is that of an activist, maybe more. But we academics need you activists. You provide a channel, a forum for us to have our voices heard. You facilitate critical sounds that can enter society much more quickly than, say, through the academic avenues. And to get to an answer to your question, Claire, that's exactly why I wrote the article, because, these are unprecedented times. We're in an incredible time crunch. We have a sustainability problem that's so huge, and we're still looking at it, sniffing, scratching, smelling, trying to get a handle on it. We haven't yet. And I wanted to contribute my bit. I felt for a long time that this sustainability model that is the conventional model that's been adapted is much too narrow and requires a much broader perspective. And if it doesn't get a broader perspective, we'll be spinning our wheels and not getting anywhere. So as Belle mentioned, indigeneity and indigenous clothing traditions are under threat. And the conventional sustainability model is not taking this into consideration. I, as an anthropologist, see how incredibly tightly the two are linked. And I wanted to share that. I bring an experience, I think, that is not the norm in fashion studies, because usually people in fashion studies are within that entity, fashion studies, and not looking outside it. They don't have the opportunity, maybe, or the language or the time. So I felt that what I could bring to this conversation as an anthropologist who's had my eye on things outside the fashion mecca, the fashion, what should I call it, dynamic. Well, that's not even true, because certainly outside the fashion dynamic, it's certainly there. But anyway, outside the fashion world, I thought that I could contribute something. And I also want to say there's an emotional motivation to writing this article, and that is, anger, frustration, and the emotional problem of having witnessed so much pain and unfairness and thinking, why is this ignored? Why is this being denied? Why aren't people doing something about this? And feeling that now is the time to share that, because it seems that people are more than ever now willing to look at these kinds of new ideas. We're in a crunch and we have to.
Thanks.
Yeah. What I saw in Indonesia is not, so I don't want to just talk about my fieldwork here, but I believe that what I saw in Indonesia is symptomatic for what's happening all over the world right now.
Yeah, thanks. I think it's interesting that sort of as I've gone through sort of looking at sustainability work, working with fashion, learning about a lot of climate science, it feels like it's come to me quite late in life to understand that there is something that we need from anthropologists at this time, in terms of the narrowness that you speak about. I'm fully feel the pain of that, having educated on sustainability for quite a long time, and feeling now like I have to say to people, well, to be honest, it's the way that we do it at the moment. We're not doing it. It's a very poorly filled space in terms of the sort of breadth of the thinking, and it feels to me like I've even watched the fashion sector. I've probably said this before to many people, but go from when I first did this work, we've talked about ethical fashion, and I think the concept of ethics being with fashion is so such an oxymoron. It's so impossible for people to actually conceive of that being real, that now we've evolved into this sustainability fashion space, which is like, you can make it in the same awful ways but with recyclable materials or something, so in your article you've got a really clear critique of sustainability and in the Western kind of notion of what that means. So do you want to elaborate a little bit on what you think it's lacking with a bit more detail?
Yes, I'm very glad to have this opportunity to do that. I was pondering how on earth I would answer a question like that, and I think essentially it's what you say, Claire. We can't just sort of reduce, reuse, recycle, and so on. We need to have a radically different narrative. We've got to change the narrative. That's our goal right now. I'd like to preface these remarks in answer to this question by saying that I have tremendous appreciation for the current efforts that are being expressed towards sustainability. People are doing an amazing job. They're tackling this problem from every angle, and it's magnificent what's been discovered so far. The research being done to make the fashion industry circular commands respect. The use of agricultural waste. I just had a friend in my apartment telling me yesterday how they're looking in Eindhoven here in the Netherlands at cow dung and how you can use the cellulose and cow dung to make yarn. And I know I've seen that, say, with crab shells and so on. They're making yarn from all kinds of agricultural waste. experimentation with clothing production systems to restore land. And still I remain unconvinced, as do you, that business as usual with new techno fixes and adaptations is going to get us where we want to be. Efficiency is not the answer. And I think we've learned that from CO2 emissions, that the more emissions, or at least the more sustainable energy we're able to produce, the better. But where there's a system based on growth, and that's our economic system, we can't keep up. So the emissions are going up, even though sustainable sources are also increasing. So, we're spinning our wheels. So that's why there has to be a radically new course. And I think that's probably why I'm here today to talk within the degrowth framework with you. So if I've been talking about how all these arrows are sort of pointing at fashion, trying to tweak, change, give technological changes. And I would say that I would like to change that image of arrows pointing at the center, and or at least not change it, but add to that a concentric circle model. So that we can understand that fashion problem is the central circle, and that we as reformers of every type have to get outside that central problem and look at it from outside. And I think we have to break free of the conceptual world that fashion has constructed for us, to operate outside of it. Decolonial theorists would call this delinking. And right now, the conventional sustainable framework is perpetuating the key myths of the fashion industry. And that's exactly what will constrain its success. So if we say that the primary myth of fashion is that fashion is like the global economy, we think of it as a thing. And fashion is not a thing. It's a construct. It's a flawed product of our collective making. We can change it. It's a colonial flawed product of our collective making. And addressing it as a thing, or in other words, as having some kind of a priori existence, means that the focus is fixed on the thing and not on its context and how and why it was constructed the way it is. And I think we can poke at it like it's in a petri dish if we're standing outside, but not if we're also in that petri dish with it. And that's my point. We have to get outside the petri dish. And only by becoming aware of and addressing the role of fashion within a larger context can the we that dresses in industrially produced clothing hope to learn how to clothe our bodies in ways that don't do harm to the earth, but even can resuscitate it. So we have to share that capacity to learn that with the outside circle, with the whole universe of clothing. So it lacks the big picture. We're lacking right now the big picture. We have outside the small picture thousands of clothing systems we have or we had, because they're under sharp erosion, that don't operate within that, or didn't operate within that industrial scheme. And they need to be understood, treasured, protected, accounted for, revived, encouraged. We need them desperately. I think some people don't realize how desperately we need it. And maybe we can get into that later. But it's only when we can delink that the whole fashion system suddenly explodes. Suddenly then garment workers are not garment workers, because that's an element of the economic system of fashion right now. But they're women with their own clothing traditions, with their own skills that may be derived from their own clothing traditions, which are being eroded because they're chained to the making of our clothes. Gender and gender relations we can see as something that's being promoted by the visuals of our fashion system. And maybe they can be exploded as well. They become more variable and more fluid. We think of clothes as a commodity because that's how we grow up. It's kind of like thinking, oh, chicken is something that grows in the grocery store because you've never been on a farm. But when you get outside the grocery store and you go to a farm, you see that chickens are living beings. Clothing is not a commodity, but it's a socially constructed meaning system with powerful symbolism. We can learn to appreciate that. The fashion industry encourages us to focus on individualism. Mirror, mirror on the wall, who's the fairest of them all? That's promoted by the fashion industry. It's like putting a set of blinkers on us so that we don't look outside. That narcissism keeps us nicely narrow. I was listening to a webinar the other day about fashion sustainability, and the panelists were talking about how they hadn't purchased clothes in several years, and how, it's so important to stop purchasing, which of course is true. We all know that. But when you think beyond the ick, the me, and we learn, say, from the World Bank statistics that 40% of clothing is tossed before it's even worn once, then you know that whole argument about how I'm reducing my clothing consumption, it's just not going to cut it. It's not about what we're doing as individuals. It's about the social phenomenon. It's about the power relations that are built into it, that are maintained by the fashion industry. Emphasis on design. We've all known that we fashion theorists and fashion activists and so on have been sort of shunted aside for a long time because, we're dealing with the fluffy, the lightweight, the feminine, the pink. And if that emphasis on changing design in fashion gives way to a broader understanding, and very serious, of how politics, economics, power relations are built into and maintained by the fashion industry, then we're getting somewhere. So all these other myths about femininity, design, and so on, they all grow out of that initial one of thinking that fashion is a thing, putting it there a priori in front of us, whereas it's not a priori. We constructed it, and we constructed it for a reason, and it's time for us to figure that out, why, and then change it. So over to you again, Claire.
Thanks so much, Sandra. So much in what you've just said. I think, one of the things that's deeply frustrated me over my career in fashion is the kind of the level of the political discourse, basically, inside the industry, because I've known a tremendous number of hugely smart, empathic, creative, dynamic, brilliant people, but I've so often found myself in spaces where you reach the bit of the conversation where it's like, okay, and now there's a power and a politics conversation to have, and being deeply disappointed basically by the results so often, and I think that's the kind of fair criticism that sometimes is laid at the steps of the circular fashion economy thinkers, because it's not enough, is it, just to say, let's not put things in the bin, let's not put things in the ground, or let's, try and make things more efficient. It so feels in my sort of guts that I know that it's not enough, that it's not going where we need to go. So throughout this article, you've got the distinction very clearly between fashion and non-fashion. And I found that really fascinating to work with through as I read through the piece. So do you want to explain what you mean by the distinction and why is that so important?
Yeah, well, you've hit the nail on the head, Claire. To my mind, it's absolutely core to the whole issue. And I think it's incredibly troubling that this distinction, fashion, non-fashion, is implicit in the current sustainability framework. I had hoped so, that it wouldn't land up there. As it's precisely this dichotomous thinking is what's preventing us from achieving our goal of sustainability. I noticed in the advertisement for today that you use the quote, "Racism is built into the definition of fashion." And this is the route that we've come to now. It's precisely the production of the distinction between fashion and non-fashion that is racism. there needs to be a broader recognition that the Western fashion system is a colonial construction. It's a colonial fashion is a colonial category. It's a product of colonialism. And I describe that in my article. And I see currently fashion myself in economic terms as a strategy to extract money from wearers. It has very little to do anymore with covering the body. If 40% is thrown away before it's worn, something else going on there. Western fashion is about capitalism. It's about industry expansion. It's about expanding. And it's about performing modernity by deploying the bodies of people as a strategy for expanding the industry. So that capitalist goal is not a side effect of our clothing system. It's the goal of it. The distinction between fashion, which the West has, and non-fashion, which other peoples have, is about ego. It's about the colonial ego. It's about hubris. It's a conceptual binary that power holders impressed on the world and perpetuated because they had the power to do so. The binary, those with fashion, those without, is about power. And think about how recently we see in books on clothing, fashion history, that there's now people who agree that perhaps India and China have clothing systems over time that change just like fashion, and maybe we can consider them fashion. It's about geopolitics. It's not about clothing. In fact, when you take a look at clothing systems, any clothing system, of course, there's change over time. And the dynamic of that change is what's interesting about fashion dynamics all around the world. There's nothing really special about the Western variant, except that it's a variation on the theme and that it continues to be supported. It was created by and is supported by a dominant economic system. So it's been allowed to balloon into a monster. And the legacy of this distinction, fashion, non-fashion, is what we see around us all the time. A focus on the fashion industry and the clothing it produces to the exclusion of all other forms of dress. And that's precisely what my article wants to bring to the attention of fashion educators, consumers, activists, all of us, that we're forgetting the other half. It's been hidden. And that obscuring is the problem. And it's also the strategy of the fashion system to hide that other part. So we can delude ourselves into thinking that fashion is a singular thing, rather than a strategy of power holders in the colonial era to make a distinction between us and them, to parade power.
Thanks, Sandra. Yeah, I think there's also been something really so eye-opening to me only since I read your article previous, which I was introduced to by meeting you on the panel before Christmas, about this idea of the term sacrifice zone and how that could be such an important term for fashion. Basically, I think I'd heard it used some places in the environment movement, let's say, but in terms of understanding resource extraction, maybe I would understand it if I was thinking about fossil fuel industry, maybe I would understand it if I was thinking about mining, but the idea of being able to take a term like that and apply it to an industry and apply it to a culture or to a cultural impact, I guess, is something which I think has been a really, really valuable piece of what I've been sort of offered by reading your work. So do you want to just say a little bit about why the term sacrifice zone kind of resonates so much with you and why it's such an important concept to think through in this work that you've been doing?
Thank you, Claire. Yeah, certainly a sacrifice zone, that whole conception of allowing for sacrifice has everything to do with that binary, the fashion, non-fashion. And I first learned about that by reading Edward Said's Orientalism. And he wrote about othering and how that us-them dichotomy turns the West into the norm and the rest into irrelevance. And it's about, again, colonialism, racial hierarchy, imperialism, power. It's about constructing a global binary, us and not us. And it's Naomi Klein, actually, who connected that for me to the whole issue of sacrifice zones, because she pointed out that the climate crisis is only possible if there is othering. And there's a quote of hers that I find so powerful. She said, "Once the other has been firmly established, the ground is softened for any transgression. Violent expulsion, land theft, occupation, because of course the whole point of othering is that the other does not have the same rights, the same humanity as the people doing the othering." So she's explored that. And of course, I shouldn't say of course, but she doesn't mention the fashion system that I'm aware of, but the parallels are really strong. She's pointed out that sacrifice zones are areas where dispensable people live, where the other lives, and therefore the destruction doesn't matter at all. And that regions can be destroyed because what's destroyed doesn't matter. And that's what it hit me, that Indigenous and local dress systems are being sacrificed by the fashion system in precisely the same way. And yet nobody's talking about that because it's not relevant, it's sort of like beyond the pale. So, and fashion, when you think about it, fashion is about othering. That is what fashion can do. It's not about pretty clothes and innovative designs solely. Othering is one of the main objectives of fashion. Fashion is about making distinctions that are hierarchical. And that's why presidents, wives, and queens and super rich are obliged to dress splendidly. And fashion gave coloniality an appearance, a look, in contradistinction to the colonized. Try to imagine colonialism without fashion. So the sacrifice zone in fashion is the fashions of others. And of course, it intersects with all the other sacrifice zones that you've mentioned, Claire, like mining for fossil fuels, production of fibers, think of cotton and so on, the emission of CO2, the exploitation of labor, all of those things that conventional fashion sustainability focuses on. But sustainability hasn't focused on the sacrifice zone that is specific to fashion, and that is the erasure of other fashion systems. That's been left out. And in that way, by leaving that out, the sustainability framework is adopting an erasure that the fashion system has devised and implemented. And that's what made me so upset. That's why I wrote the article. Another thing I have to mention is that the whole concept of sacrifice zone itself incorporates a conceptual erasure, because it's looking at zones. It's not looking at people. It's not looking at cultures. And when I say fashion has a sacrifice zone, I'm rowing against the stream, because I'm saying a sacrifice zone isn't just a place. It's also culture. It's also people. So the conceptual erasures are built into the term sacrifice zone. We tend in our framework of sustainability to focus on the physical environment to the exclusion of social and cultural environments. It's always about the ecological footprint. It's always about CO2. But the term sacrifice zone, I think it's so important to expand it, just the same as we have to expand the whole notion of the sustainability framework and take a look at what's being erased by the term.
Super, thanks. Yeah, I think it's also, the reason why I think this resonates so much with us in terms of the team from Fashion Act Now and people who've been working on fashion stuff in XR is that seems clear to me that the industry at large, who have responded, quite substantially to the impact of our protests, and directly communicating with the British Fashion Council, telling them that we're going to go and do protests outside, that there will be disruption, that there will be we'll make a big noise, that we would love to talk to them more about the situation that we're in. That this impact that we've had so far appears to me to be like primarily cultural impact. And what strikes me about that is the parallel, almost, that you can understand the industry as a cultural phenomenon, and a cultural phenomenon which is dominant and destructive in its charging around the world and dominating everyone else's systems of dress in a way. But also, I think that's precisely the reason why it's so important in the context of sustainability to go to the fashion industry to try and make change, because it is a cultural space. And I think once you open these conversations, you're speaking to people who understand perfectly well the cultural sort of object that is fashion, but it needs so much for us to sort of begin to weave these pieces together, really, so that we can understand why the cultural aspect of it is so crucial to the sustainability conversation, and why it's such a massive sort of gaping hole in a way, which is what I feel from your work, is that you're saying, hey, there's this big hole here, no one's looked at it, you're sort of pretending it's not there, but it feels to me like it's ripe for this conversation, if that makes sense, and precisely because of the type of industry it is, the type of people that are in it. So in your article, you've got this I'm going to say her name wrong, Mrs. Sitio. Is that how you say it? You've got this lady, Mrs. Sitio, who you speak about, and there are obviously communities and people that you've worked with at length there. So do you want to talk a little bit about some of their stories and the communities that you've done your field work with? Okay,
I'd love to, because of course that's my strong motivator in all of this, seeing how they're being sacrificed and trying to understand the dynamic. For our audience that may not have read the article, I'd like to explain first about who Mrs. CTO is, because she lives in the sacrifice zone and she's being sacrificed, and I want to explain that. I met her a few times. She's on the top of Samosir Island in the middle of Lake Toba, and she lived in her village. She had learned to weave when she was very young, and she was now married, had a couple of kids, and her husband was a farmer, and she was weaving to supplement the family income. They lived in a very isolated area, far from the markets, difficult to achieve or to get there. And so she wove to supplement the family income. We know from the work of Elwood Pye, for instance, I think that was in the 1980s that he wrote his book explaining how craft is a supplement to farming income, and that it's kind of a fallback for Indigenous families or for peasants and so on. What was happening for Mrs. CTO is that the market for Indigenous textiles in North Sumatra has been eroding very quickly. So she was weaving faster and faster and more to try to bridge the gap that it was creating financially. But eventually it made no sense for her to weave anymore. She was too frustrated, worn down. So she, collected money because she didn't have any. I guess she got donations and moved to the big city, moved to the island of Java, which is far away and expensive when you got kids and a husband and you're going there probably by boat. But I think about the costs of that move for her. Her children especially are losing their connection with their family, with their language, with their ritual system, with their culture, with their region, their homelands, with their cultural identity, in short. And why did they go away? They went away on hope, with a desire for a better life. And I don't know what became of her. I phoned her, but her telephone number was changed. But I assume that what she ended up with is uncertainty, low wages, and exploitation. She's joining, 60 million other people that are being displaced for various reasons and going to the city to look for a better life. And perhaps she's ended up as a slave within the clothing industry and an inability to return home, and her children will grow up that way without a clear identity. So her region back home has lost another weaver, has lost her talents and skills and knowledge. And so they're sacrificed as well. And Mrs. CTO will be a so-called de-skilled worker working in a factory, and her skills won't be acknowledged, recognized, practiced, and will disappear. So, Mrs. CTO is just a representative of something that's happening all around the world right now. Craft markets are going down. The global economy is rendering ancient crafts anachronistic and absurd. Handiwork can't compete with mechanized production. People who do handiwork are poor and work very, very hard. They get no rewards. They're eroded by mechanical production. The villages where they live are usually not supported. Policymakers are stuck in that capitalist frame of thought that development and getting ahead in the global economy is the only thing that counts. And so these people are not being supported by their governments. So I could tell you lots of stories, but I think that it's also fair to say that every story is a variation on Mrs. CTO's story. I can tell you about a weaver that wept uncontrollably when I showed her my film about weaving 100 years ago, based on an old text. And I said, "Why are you crying?" And she said, "Oh, those poor people, they worked so hard, they probably didn't get any money for it." Not recognizing that, of course, the economic system has changed and that, in fact, she's poorer than her ancestors. I can tell you about a woman who became hysterical when I suggested that women, young girls in the village, start to weave again and that I would try to assist them. And she just went hysterical because she thought of what that was like for her to finally admit defeat and put down her loom when she was extremely poor. It was the only thing she had to rely on. Her husband was sick. So she was in dire poverty and she couldn't even earn from her loom. And there's that associated shame, associated sense of worthlessness, failure. And that's why handicrafts are dying out. I mean, what child would aspire to that kind of life and low status? And so, given that we've been talking about dualism, I'd like to just for a minute draw attention to this term craft. When the first visitors from Britain early in the 19th century visited the shores of North Sumatra, they talked about local industry. And it wasn't until there was a hegemony of industry in Europe over the local industry in North Sumatra that it became denigrated as craft, a counterpole to industrial production. And through that demotion of craft, it becomes kind of like hobby, inconsequential, downplayed in its importance, denigrated. Craft is put on the lower rungs of an historical ladder. It's the early period, and then you work towards modernity with industrialization being the definition of success in the modern world. So the logic is that primitive craft will disappear. It's not essential. It's not that important. It's cute. There is not a recognition of its value. And that's how Indigenous clothing systems are disappearing. They're being called craft. They're being outcompeted. And the industrial systems that harm the planet are expanding, and we're looking at how to degrow. So it's important that we start looking at other fashion systems around the world that are being degraded and disappearing because of that growth ethic. We could also take a look at Western fashion history. this whole issue of education. Where do we find in discussions of fashion history synopses of what's been happening with Indigenous so-called craft and its relationship to fashion history? It's erased. It's no surprise that you didn't sort of consider that those issues were important until much later in your career on fashion. And yet that whole relationship between fashion and Indigenous systems that we now call craft is important because it's an explanatory aspect of fashion history. And Indigenous crafts have so much to explore, not least of which include adaptations to local physical and cultural and historical environments. There's amazing technical skill, absolutely mind-boggling, stunning technical skill in Indigenous clothing systems. Innovations in the use of fibers and dyes and so on. And it's not as though the commercialization of a local fiber or dye or technique will ensure the survival of a craft. And I know we hear that so many times now, that sort of somebody from the fashion system is now using somebody in a village in India to do their embroidery work for them, because then at least the technique won't die out. I would argue that to break it up into component parts like that is to fail to understand how an Indigenous clothing system lives in its own context. It's like a species that needs an ecosystem in order to survive. You can't save the polar bears unless you have ice for them to walk on. You can't break fashion systems down into component bits and think that you're doing it justice by saying, oh, well, we're using their techniques in our fashion. Right now I'm working on an analysis of a textile in North Sumatra, and I'm so struck by its holism of design, technique, social order, religious system, ritual, conception of the universe. It's all piled into one textile, if you can read the textile. And it's such an incredibly densely well-wrought piece of cloth. And it meant literally the whole world to the people before their whole world started to unravel. And now they don't even know anymore what it meant to them. So when you begin to scratch the surface of the kind of identity that's being lost when people lose their clothing systems, you just start imagining a huge chasm that has opened up, that, you know, we've lost so much already. And we're right now at a very critical phase. We either have to do something about it, repair, or we're going to end up with a very impoverished world when it comes to knowledge systems and the wealth of culture that once was. It's being sacrificed, yeah.
Yeah, so, I mean, well, this is also where I see all the dots, if you like, that all need to be joined up, and it feels sometimes very busy in my mind trying to think through all of this stuff. But it's definitely something to do with looking at all of this work around degrowth and all of this work around decolonizing systems and people's cultural institutions and thinking and everything. And also just, you know, I'm so at the beginning of my sort of journey to learn as well about reparations, restorative justice, and how much repair is needed in the world. And I think it feels really obvious to me, because I would be able to understand it through the lens of like how important some textiles are, or how important I think it is to, you know, have a piece of material, whether that's a garment or a piece of cloth or something, and to actually physically repair it. And something there's something very easy to understand once you start to sort of think about it in that way. It becomes like something practical. But I think there are many kind of dots to be joined up. So I'm just seeing the time, and I want to make sure that we bring in a couple of questions from the audience. So I'm just going to ask you one more question, and maybe I can sort of pull two together, because we've got two that I wanted to say. And so the first question was really to ask you about how this series on degrowth has led us to here, and to understand something of your feelings of the term degrowth. Really, I'm interested in that always. Like, how do people feel about saying it? How do people feel about talking about it? This is quite a paradigm shift, really, actually. And then the final sort of question is, just about the effect that you're hoping that your work, that this thinking, and that your work on fashion systems thinking can have in an ideal world. So go for it, and then I'll bring in a question from the audience.
Okay, thanks, Claire. I'll try to speed up a bit here. It's interesting that you consider this degrowth a new paradigm, because I think of the Limits to Growth and the Club of Rome. What was that in the 60s? And this limits to growth has been discussed forever, but maybe now we're finally getting around to phrasing it in terms of a strategy or an activity, or how the hell do you do it? The definition of degrowth is so simple: a planned downscaling of resources and energy use. And we know that it's necessary, that we can't achieve our climate goals unless there is degrowth. Jason Hickel, whose work I incredibly admire, has pointed out that where the economic system that we currently have depends on growth, it's not possible to attain 100% sustainable energy in the time that we have available. So it's either degrow or die. And also the use of other planetary resources is much too large, so that's not sustainable either. So the interesting part for me about degrowth, that's the obvious part. The interesting part for me is that because the North and the wealthy few use disproportionately so much more than the vast majority of people living in the world, degrowth will imply a change in relations between North and South. So that's what's key to our discussion right now about fashion, because we're talking about a change in relationship between global North and global South with fashion when we recognize other people. So while I thoroughly stand behind degrowth, obviously, I also move now into a terrain that's maybe my concerns with the whole issue of degrowth. And that is, will it imply decolonization? Because I've noticed, for instance, in discussions about degrowth, people are focusing on things like better wages for people working in the fashion system, better working conditions, and making a better piece of clothing. But they're still operating within that central fashion area, and they're not looking outside it. And that is, will there be, through degrowth, a focus on Indigenous and local clothing systems? And will they have a chance to regenerate or be supported? That's the question that rises for me. Expansion of the industry is not just about expanded resource use, but it's also about the decline and disappearance of other clothing systems that were in balance with the local environment. And this is what's being forgotten, ignored, and erased. Will degrowth automatically bring that into the picture? I don't think so. I think that we have to do that, bring that to the whole degrowth paradigm. We know that for Indigenous fashion systems to survive, they need forests, clean water, healthy soil, thriving biodiversity. Will degrowth imply repair? Not explicitly. Should it? Yes, definitely. But I'm not sure that framework incorporates that, and it has to. Will it imply the cessation of othering in fashion? Will it imply the cessation of exploitation? Does it imply decoloniality? I hope so. the jury's out. I don't know. I think it needs to be made explicit and it needs to be worked on assiduously. We also need pluriversality, that is to say, diversity in fashion expressions, not just everything revolving around one central industrial system, even if it is degrown. Pluriversality, there's got to be room for other facets of clothing expressions to emerge or to survive. Is this also implied in degrowth? I don't know. Maybe you can answer that better than I can. But fashion sustainability activists, educators, business leaders have to acknowledge and act on this to ensure that there is room for other systems. Do I still have time, Claire, to talk about my wish list?
Yeah, sure. Go for it.
Okay. Thank you, because this is the most important part. I'm not getting younger. I know none of us is, but, I'm retired. And I really hope that people in the audience here will run with the balls of the ideas that I'm launching today, or at least sharing. Let's see. Conceptual erasures. Those are the stumbling block. You've mentioned it yourself, how you've had them. And that was certainly the reason why I had such a hard time writing this article, is because I kept running up against, that's not how we think normally about things. I had to sort of bust myths. There are erasures promoted by politics, economics, advertising, education, also personal experience. And the implications of othering are just not that front and center in how people view the world. So I want to invite everybody to start thinking about conceptual erasures and bring it into their curricula. There's also so little known about other systems of clothing that is really hard for people to get their minds around them because they've never encountered them. So how do you revise curricula accommodating these ideas? How can industry deal with it when they have no sense of it except, a design out there that they can sort of appropriate? How do you devise strategies for support? Maybe we have to get together and talk about this and devise a practical way of learning how to support Indigenous fashion systems. So we've got to change the narrative. Fashion history, fashion education, fashion marketing, fashion business, all have to acknowledge and act on coloniality in fashion. The role that fashion has played with respect to othering, exploitation, erasure, appropriation, enclosure, loss of culture, destruction of Indigenous clothing systems and design, relations to waste. We've got to pull in the non-Western, the other, into all of these issues. So, fashion educators especially, we have to write a new curriculum. Do we have to get together? We should get together and start talking about what a new curriculum looks like. We have to get rid of that solipsistic emphasis on design because it is solipsistic. And what we need is that to give way to a culture of repair and care and empathy. I'm not going to get this done in time, am I? You were looking at the clock, I can tell. I want people to, in curricula especially, to attend to the human universal of bodily adornment, not the Western fashion system. That's, of course, a legitimate focus of study, but it shouldn't be exclusive. So let's take a look at the human universal of bodily adornment, and then we're pulling things a little bit more in line with another reality. Just like we can track CO2 in the atmosphere and, how many wolves are running around the Netherlands, or how many, tigers are left. We should be having tabs on Indigenous clothing systems. Where's the rub? Where can we help out? Where's what is being sacrificed, when, by whom? It's not just a particular bird species that's being sacrificed by capitalist growth. It's also social systems, cultural systems. Let's see. Learn to care and repair. Let's see, what else did I want to tell you about here? Yeah. fashion justice, it has to include cultural repair. We can't just say now, okay, we'll stop expanding, we'll stop exploiting, we'll stop growing, but we have to also repair. We have to deal with our history of exploitation and destruction. So the fashion system will have to attend to this at all levels: education, design, business, so on. I'll leave it there. I know that we really, really want to hear the questions by people in the audience, to have them involved in this whole discussion. It's edifying for both sides. So I'll just leave it there.
Okay. Oh, thank you so much, Sandra. I feel like I'm going to have to listen to this back again to make my notes. I can't do it whilst I'm hosting. But thank you for bringing all of that. And I think it's really, it's so kind of accessible listening to you speak about it, because some of this is kind of, you know, can feel a little complex, can feel a little bit like there's a few moving parts here. And I mean, it's the pluriversality conversation is the antithesis of what we actually sort of swim in culturally, particularly here in the UK or in Europe or in America. So thank you so much for everything that you've said so far. I'm going to take a couple of questions from the audience, and we'll just run over slightly if that's okay with you. One question that I think is really interesting is that there's an increasing kind of movement in the environmental sector towards Indigenous, looking to Indigenous cultures for answers and especially in stewardship, which is a really nice word to use for that, I think. But how much hope do you actually have that the questioning of this is going to transfer to our dominant fashion system? And I think this is often a very thorny question, really, isn't it? When you start to think about like cultural power, even when I'm saying in the fashion industry that I've struggled to have like the conversations I want to have about political power or economic power, I somehow feel cultural power is even more sort of not spoken about somehow, isn't it?
Yeah, that's a difficult question. It's really a question about hope, isn't it? Could you read again for me the precise question?
Yeah, sure.
How much hope do I have?
There's an increasing movement in environmentalism to look towards Indigenous cultures for answers and stewardship. How much hope do you have that this questioning will transfer to the dominant fashion system?
I don't have that much hope that we're going to have the world of 100 years ago with thriving fashion systems and of a pluriversal nature. So much has been eroded, so much has disappeared, and I feel that we're struggling together with the same thorny problem of sustainability and the future of our universe, our future of our planet. And that we have to hold hands north-south to work it through. It's not a question purely of going to other people's and saying, how did you do it? Maybe we can get some tips from you, although that would be a really good thing. We know that there are still uncontacted peoples in the Amazon. We know that the rainforest is disappearing very quickly in South America, and that Indigenous peoples there are losing their habitat. Really, it's about the cessation of sacrifice zones. So it's that's part and parcel with degrowth. It's part and parcel of eliminating this othering. How much hope do we have? Well, we've seen an awful lot of change happen in the past 2 years. It's a matter of how much people get behind this. It's a matter of how much energy we are going to spend on it, and whether we get together and decide to do a kind of sustainable clothing watch for the whole world. I hope somebody will do that.
Me too. There's something that we've demanded from the fashion space, I guess, as a demand some time ago through the Extinction Rebellion campaigning, and that was to ask the British Fashion Council to cancel London Fashion Week and instead hold a meeting. And I think in some ways the thought of that idea of bringing people together to discuss what to do and how to do it, particularly if you give the weight of importance to a cutter from a factory, or a cotton farmer, or to a machinist, or to a designer, a product developer. To me, the idea is very much about bringing back together people who've been separated and told that they're different, who actually, if you sat them around one table with one conversation, and I'm sure that a lot of them would just feel like they were all equals, but we don't really seem to be able to see that kind of space being held in our industry. And I think an awful lot of this problem that we face with what we've been talking about is something that my friend Gail says a lot, is you want to get your family back. There's sort of recognition that we are all interconnected around the world. There's no getting away from that now. It's really, really quite obvious. If you doubted it before, you can't anymore. And in that way, I feel like the fashion industry to be brought together in that way, and fashion producers and textile producers and manufacturers from across the system to really talk about what is going on. And, perhaps also with retailers, also with models, also with, with all kinds of different stakeholders, that I really long to see what that kind of conversation could bring about, because it feels to me like there's such an urgency to the climate and ecological emergency and the sustainability agenda right now, because everyone's going emergency. But we really need to make sure that we respond to this in the most sort of united and wise way, and getting a really, really broad spectrum of people around a table kind of makes a lot of sense from my position anyway, seeing what Extinction Rebellion is advocating for in terms of participation in democracy, and saying, well, let's decide together how we're going to deal with things. Don't want those people who are running things now to decide how to change things for the better from here. They're going to decide the emergency moves that they make. I think it's really, really crucial that people come together to say a collective no to that. You're in charge now, but you're not going to decide how we're going to deal with this crisis, So yeah, but there's something of that sort of reconnection, isn't there? And we're so capable of it now with the way that technology works, the way this is happening, and it seems like it's absolutely, the conversation has to begin between a big variety of stakeholders, really. Do you agree?
Yeah, the problem is getting the people without voices at the table, and recognizing that there are other tables where other people are sitting and tackling the issue as well, and then intersecting with those, because we can pull our whole industry together, but then we end up, then we're in that concentric circle model again, where we're dealing with our industry, our problem, and we're forgetting its multitude ways of linking up with other cultures, and that they also need to have their say at their own table and at ours. That bringing together that you're talking about, I think, is just terribly important. And it has to be so much broader than we can ever even conceptualize right now. How do you do it with different languages involved, different parts of the world? And of course, a lot of it too, coming to think of it, it has to be about the possibility for the local to regenerate, so that it's not, what's our big impact on the whole world, which is definitely the case. We're having a huge impact on the whole world. But if we can, through degrowth, shrink that and acknowledge that there can be alternative systems everywhere, that's the pluriversality. So that we don't have the reins in our hand, but we allow those reins to be taken elsewhere. so that we're all struggling toward the same goal, but we're all doing it in our own ways.
Yeah, I love the idea of giving the reins away. Okay, so one more question, if that's okay, because I think this is quite a good one. Could our indifference to sacrificing people be because we don't really see them? We don't know their stories. When we do hear them, from their voices, they're a character in a story about far away. And what would giving them platforms to share their experiences and what our fashion costs them, what would that help?
Yeah, that's a bit echoes the first question. If we want to go towards repairing and caring, how do we learn to care about something that's so at arm's length? And I think that this questioner is asking about erasure, how we have consistently erased. When we learn about the number of people that are washing up on shore, immigrants in Italy on a single day, and we shrug because it's been going on for years, that kind of indifference is so incredibly massive, and that we're dealing with it politically that in a way that should make us all deeply, deeply ashamed. It's very upsetting. I think it's decolonization, really coming to terms with what we're doing to our planet, not just people, but also species. It's so incredibly painful. It's very hard to think. It's very painful. And yet we have to do that. And I guess the onus is on all of us. Could our indifference be because we don't see it? Absolutely. That's the whole issue. And if we do see it, that can only change everything. I believe that people are, basically good at heart. And if they do empathize, they will want change.
I'm going to step in now and say thank you both so much. It's been a delight having, on my screen at least, an activist and academic, and actually seeing the massive crossover as well between the two. I think really the takeaway is this need, Sandra, as you said, to hold hands north and south. But as you've also made clear, that's quite a difficult conversation to have, isn't it? We bear a lot of, in the global north, a lot of responsibility. And how do we frame this? How do we reframe this relationship, not just in the fashion industry, but really throughout the globe at the moment? So I'd really like to say thank you again, both of you. Amazing to have you here. Thank you to the audience for your questions. And Sandra has very, very kindly put together a list of resources that sort of inform and expand on this conversation. So please do message us in any way you can. We're on Facebook, Twitter, any way you can, and we can get those resources up to you. Or I think actually my colleague might be uploading them on one of the platforms. But thank you, everyone, and good night.
Thank you.
Thank you. Till next time.
Till next time.